So this psalm, Psalm 46, reflects the way that a people, secure in their sense of divine protection, look on, while surrounding nations are convulsed. It could well be that this was Israel in the 7th century BC, while Egypt and Assyria were rending the east in their fierce rivalries. The language used in this psalm resembles the language used by Isaiah when describing events that culminated in the destruction of Sennacherib's army at the very gates of Jerusalem. You may remember that story where the army was there by Jerusalem and suddenly they weren't. Especially in the language, the use of God is with us, Elohim Imanu, which is similar to Isaiah's use of Emmanuel. There is a refrain, verses 7 and 11. And probably there should have been one after verse 3, but it seems to be missing. And they form part of the poetical form of the psalm. And we'll see later that it is very clear that in verse 3, perhaps there should have been verse 4 because the form is actually disturbed. During this psalm, the psalmist asserts God's mastery, first of all, in verses 1 to 3, over nature. Secondly, in verses 4 to 7, his mastery over the attackers of his city, Jerusalem. And thirdly, God's mastery over the whole warring world, and that's verses 8 to 11. So over nature, over the attackers of the city, and over the whole of the warring world. If we go to the title of the psalm, they don't always put the titles in, but the title of the psalm, you'll see that there are two designations. The first is to the director of music, and you probably have that in your version. It's going to be something like the precentor at the cathedral, and it's an official musical post. It's found also in Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 19 and in 2 Chronicles in one or two places. Then you have another one of the psalms of the sons of Korah. As you remember, Psalm 42 was. This is part of a little set of psalms from 42 to 49. But the second part is all about this term Alamoth, according to Alamoth, a song. And I don't know about you, but whenever I read these titles, I haven't got a clue what they're on about. Not a clue. And this particular one, apparently, is a musical direction. It's something like for the sopranos. They don't actually know, but that's probably the suggestion. And I thought that was quite funny, given that the sopranos in those days could also have been male. So you never know. We're going back to those times, I think. Anyway, verses 1 to 3. This is all about God's mastery over nature. The first line of this psalm is used by Luther for his hymn, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. It's one of the, a mighty fortress is our God. And it's the opening thought of this psalm. The idea is that we find our security, a mighty fortress is our God, in God, and not in anything else, not in anything that God's made, but in God and God alone. And that sense of refuge also is something that's quite special. The idea that we find our unchanging shelter in God's salvation or God's strength. And the idea of strength is the idea of God empowering the weak for action, and also a sense of a sure stronghold. A mighty stronghold is our God. There's also this phrase, a very present help in trouble. You may not have it quite like that, but that's what it says. A better rendering of this is an often found help in times of trouble. In that sense that whenever we're in trouble, it's very natural to turn to God and to find strength and courage in God. And thinking of this time of COVID, it seems to me that particularly we find ourselves and others turning to God and looking for strength. Somebody, in fact, wrote to me very recently, a couple of days ago, saying thank you for the support and the prayers that you've given during this time of COVID. And of course, we get our strength from God. It's God who gives that ability, that strength to be able to support. It also has a sense of the readiness that God has to be found. And again, it's an interesting thought that God is always ready to be found by those in trouble. always. And sometimes we say, oh, you only ever turn to God when there's an issue. But actually God wants to be found. He wants people in their troubles to turn to him. And you can see that in Isaiah 55 verse 6. And also a sense of him being enough for any situation. There is no situation beyond God. And we look in Joshua 17 verse 16, Zechariah 10 verse 10, and we see echoes of that. Moving on to verse 2, the idea of the earth and the mountains are ideas of things that cannot and do not change, immutable, unchangeable. And we get put up against that a symbol of what is most restless and menacing, namely the sea. So you've got these two symbols. And the whole idea is it completes the end of the whole created scheme by which the earth, the mountains, and the waters are set in place. And it's described in Psalm 104, verses 5 to 9. The undoing glimpsed here is made explicit in Psalm 102, verse 25 and following, where the final security of God's servants is made very clear. So this is the idea of the upheaval of nature. God, as nature is upheaved, being there and being in control. Though the earth be moved, literally, at the changing of the earth. Earthquakes and volcanoes were probably a regular thing which were seen by travellers who went to the east. They were always going on, and in fact they still are. Verse 3, though the waters, literally, they roar, they foam the sea. Very interesting that Hebrew is a very different language to ours. And at the end of verse 3, the whole of the verse falls away as if it's been cut short. We can't see it in the English, but in the Hebrew, it's clear that something is missing. The whole poetic rhythm changes, and there's a real sense in which it should continue, but it doesn't. And that's why people say, perhaps, after verse 3, the first part of this psalm, perhaps there should have been a verse very much like verse 7. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. But it isn't there. Moving on to verses 4 to 7. This is all about God's mastery over the attackers at the gates of the city. Verse 4, the river alludes to a perennial river, an ever-flowing river. As you may know, in that part of the world, there are the, if you like, the desert rivers that dry up and then start flowing. But this particular river, spoken of by the psalmist, is actually an ever-flowing river. It's one that never stops flowing. And whose streams make glad the city of God. What a great thought. This stream of water is always there. And of course, it's something which is very reassuring. And the term river is a Hebrew term, nahar, and it may not refer to a literal river. There is, of course, the river Siloam that flows into Jerusalem that ends with the pool of Siloam. You may remember that in the ministry of Jesus. But there's no reason why this should be a literal river. It may be used as a symbol of God's peace and God's blessing, whose streams make glad the river, the people of God. I mean, it's a lovely thought. The city of God being made glad by the river of God. And of course, it's taken up in the New Testament and indeed in Ezekiel and other places by this sense of river, the water flowing from the temple that, you know, somebody goes into, it's ankle deep, then it's knee deep, then it's fully deep. And there's a real sense in which water is so important, a symbol for Christians and for Jews, a symbol that God is always there and that God will meet all of our needs. And of course, a river brings fruit and it brings creativity, it brings blossom. So this foundation, this verse of there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, is also the foundation verse for the idea of a new Jerusalem in the New Testament, the new Jerusalem that's spoken of in so many places in the writings of Paul and in Revelation. Moving on to verse 5, right early. The verse literally means at the turning of the morning. At the break of day, it says in my version, but it's right early. literally at the turning of the morning, or as the morning approaches. And this conjures up views of what happened at the Red Sea. You may remember the Israelis went through the path of the Red Sea, got to the other side. And as they got to the other side at the break of day, the waters came back over and destroyed the army of Egypt. And there's a real harking back to that vision, which you can find in Exodus 14, verse 7. It is the presence of God in the holy city that means the holy city can't be moved. This was a belief in Old Testament times, the belief that God's presence was literally in his temple. God was present in the Holy of Holies. Really, really important understanding for the Old Testament. And indeed, that was why they were so surprised when the temple was destroyed before the exile and they were dragged away to a land of exile, because they believed that God in his temple could never be moved. And it's amazing how often we put our trust in things which are not true rather than things that are true. I'm sure God was present in his temple, and of course the Holy of Holies was a very special place, but that isn't the only place God was present. And sometimes we get the wrong end of the stick. If we look at the Christian idea, we then have not the idea of God being present in a physical temple, i.e. a place in Jerusalem, but God being present in us. You are the temple of the Holy Spirit, Paul says. And there's a sense in which now we've gone from God being located in a temple to God being located in us, in his people. Wherever his people are, there God lives. And it's interesting that the symbolism that Jesus gave at his death, the tearing of the curtain in the Holy of Holies, really makes that point. There is nothing in this place. I am tearing the temple curtain apart. But where God is now is wherever his people dwell. Wherever God's people are, Jesus brings his presence, his holiness. We come to verse 6. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Hebrew has two tenses and no connections in what it says. Literally it reads, raged heathen, tottered kingdoms, gave with his voice, melts the earth. That's what that verse actually says, which is amazing. And it leads to a vividness of picture being conjured up. The judgment of this verse implies the inherent instability of evil, and also that the voice of God is going to dissolve the world just as God's voice created the world. And that's very easy to miss out in the things that we are actually reading. So we move on to verses 7 to 11. Verse 7, the Lord of hosts is with us. Again, it doesn't say that in my version, it says the Lord Almighty. But that's quite an important difference. It may say in your version, the Lord of hosts, it should do, because this is a very specific name for God that was mainly used during the monarchy period of Israel's history. It's used 260 times in the Old Testament, never before the first book of Samuel. The first reference to it is 1 Samuel 1, verse 3. It's used 60 times by Isaiah, 80 times by Jeremiah, and yet this name for God doesn't go into the New Testament. It is only ever used once in the New Testament, just once, in the book of James, chapter 5, verse 4. And it's used of God's judgment on those who live in luxury. If you actually read it, it's all about a judgment on those who live in luxury and power, but don't have any concept at all of anyone else. And what are the hosts that the Lord of hosts is in charge of? There's a picture very much of God as the ruler, not only over the armies of Israel, but also over a heavenly host, angels and archangels, and all sorts of other beings and stars. God in charge, a picture of the Lord who can call on light and power in any and every situation. And this is really an affirmation of the faith of the psalmist. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Some of the versions actually have refuge. But the real word is actually a word which speaks about God being in high places. God is a high place for us, is the Hebrew. The God of Jacob is a high place for us. In other words, a place where we are safe and we cannot be attacked. So that brings us on to verses 8 to 11, which is God's mastery over the whole warring world. This section really speaks about God doing all sorts of things to those who bring warfare and a lack of peace on the face of the earth. Verse 8, the Lord is referred to as Elohim. Come and see the works of the Lord. You may remember that we spoke last time about this part of the Psalter using the word Elohim for God. And it's not Yahweh, but Elohim in many of the scripts. The desolations, this is another interesting word, because it's not speaking about so much about the desolations themselves, but about the silence that desolation brings. And silence is an interesting word. It could be the silence looking at the destruction, but it could also be the wonder, the awe that this strength and destruction will bring. Behold is a word generally used for seeing with the inward eye. So when it says, see the works of the Lord, that word see is not simply a physical word. It's to say, understand, as a seer might understand the works of the Lord. Verse 9, he makes wars to cease. He breaks the bows and shatters the spears and burns. Now, there's an interesting little thing here. You may have the shields. The other word you might have is chariots. In actual fact, the Hebrew word is either shields or carts, which is interesting. Carts not really used very much in warfare. And with a slight change of the Hebrew, you can get the word shield. So it's probably shields, but we're not sure. The power of God over all other powers is presented here. And also the inherent peaceable nature of God. He comes to celebrate love, not violence and hatred. And that's seen in verse 9. The outcome is peace, but the process is judgment. Verse 9 is all about God's judgment, bringing peace. Peace is set in the image of a world that's going to be disarmed by force, not by gentle persuasion. So often we get this picture of gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Well, this psalm doesn't really speak about that. It speaks about actually God taking physical force and disarming. And sometimes when we look at the armed forces, we are not sure how Christian they are, and there's been a big debate. This verse, I think, would say very clearly, God himself will use force to prevent the warring of the people around. He has the power to do that. Verse 10, be still and know that I am God. It's more like be quiet or leave off, jack it in. It's like Jesus speaking that word to the storm, the stilling of the storm. Be still. Stop your noise. Recognize your master. And there's a real sense of that in the Hebrew. I will be exalted among the nations. This is going to make the proud quite resentful. And it's also going to encourage those who are humble and weak. And that very much is what happened in the ministry of Jesus, you may remember, that those who had power and were proud found themselves being resentful, really, at what Jesus was saying. And those who were weak and needed God discovered actually that God was encouraging them, and they took great encouragement from the words of Jesus. And then we come back, verse 11, to what we started with. So here's a summary, a quick summary. Verses 1 to 3, a troubled world, a troubled life. Though the mountains slide and the seas rage, we will not be afraid. Verses 4 to 7, troubled city, troubled church. Jerusalem speaks to the New Jerusalem, God's church. The troubled church in the ages has unfailing grace and the promise of a new day when every evil power is doomed for destruction. Verses 8 to 11. Troubled troublemakers. God will destroy all that troubles our world, and the reign of the deep evil that does unspeakable things is coming to an end. His salvation and reign of peace is a future hope, but he is also, as we read early in the psalm, a present help here and now.